So here's a bit of background on the farm. My parents bought the place in 1970. It's 244 hectares with 145 effective. So we've got a big orchard that goes through the middle with quite a bit of native and a few tree blocks. The focus since my wife and I, Antoinette, took over in 2014 has been looking after our soils, improving soil function, rooting depth, soil carbon, diversity, wildlife diversity, and mostly concentrating on grazing management. Basically, I'm too cheap to put my hands in the pocket and spend money. 2008, we had a big change in our grazing policies. You'll see a photo in a couple of slides. What was the catalyst for that? So over the summer, we do a more holistic type grazing management system. And then during the growing seasons and over the winter, it's more of an Andre Voisin type arrangement, which is a traditional dairy type grazing. Our fertiliser input's very low. The last 14 years, 3 kilos of pea, and that's not 3 kilos per year, that's 3 kilos over that 14 years. And that's mostly gone on with a bit of seed through the drill. Our aim is by Christmas, New Year, to have enough pasture cover on the property to get it through our animals through to about April. Our history in the last few years, since 2007, we were doing dairy grazing, and then we stopped that a few years ago and spent a few years rearing calves and taking them through to 12 months and then through to killing, as we've got TB in the area and also with micropattern spiders. It's made selling on that yearling market a lot more difficult. And so because of that, we're looking at moving back into more sheep again and just keeping a small breeding herd of cows, with mostly Wiltshire. This last season we bought Australian white genetics in from Australia, and I'm looking at bringing some master sheep embryos and semen in this season. I spent a bit of time at Lincoln, started Lincoln in 91, so I spent 6 years down here at Springston, and I did a lot of crutching for a couple of farmers down here. One of them had like 10,000 sheep, and he didn't believe in veteran, so it was my job to crutch them once a month. And so by the time I got to about 30, I decided, right, my game was at 40 not to crutch sheep for anyone else. If I was going to be doing it, I wanted to do it on my own. So I managed that. And then I quickly decided, right, by the time I'm 50, I don't want to crutch my own either. So that's why I've gone into the shedding. So here's the view from the top of the property, about 280 metres. The Napier Taupo Road goes in the line up through here. We're 13 kilometres up from the turn-off at the Napier end. So you can see the gorges going up through the middle of the property here. And this is what we look like on the 9th of June 2007. This was after Christmas 2006. My father said to me, if you don't come back onto the farm, I'm going to lease it out or sell. So I came on straight back on the farm to this. So I spent a few weeks crutching stock and selling most of the stock off the property, and then I went back to my building job and asked if I could have my job back for a wee while. So that was the big catalyst to change our grazing management. Having been through Lincoln, was taught, you concentrate on your pasture quality all the time, and that was sort of where you focused, and didn't really concentrate on the health of the plants or the soils or anything, and how that related. So now we try as much as possible to have a full recovery of the pasture, so grazing at the top of the pasture growth curve. During fast periods, light grazing with faster rotations, building covers, take some areas out and reserve for when the growth slows. Keep soils covered, especially in the summer and when wet. Change it up. There's a big big thing we do. Try and not do the same thing in the same paddock every year. On a property I worked on just up the road, people carved in the same paddock for the last 30 years, even though there's been 3 owners on the property. Make grazing decisions on the species you want. Don't leave the animals in to clean up undesirables. Encourage diversity of grasses, legumes and forwards, even weeds are diversity. Andre Voisin's rule was 15%. You can have 15% weeds in a pasture and it's not going to affect production. And if you got 15% of thistles in there, it actually looks like quite a bit, but it's not actually affecting your production, so why bother going out there and spraying it? It's only costing you money. So, and also, a big change in how we think of our animals is we think of them as a tool to improve our pastures, and not like we're getting told that they're just something that destroys them. So here's up on the top of the farm, on our boundary fence. So here's in January, I'm still quite away from grazing this, and it's sort of typical for the area on the neighbours. Short grass, lots of thistles. I probably have almost as many thistles, but the good thing with long grass, it hides a lot of weeds as well. So here we are, it's the same spot I've just turned around the other way, basically, but this is right at grazing. So the grass is all at mature seed heads, had time to put their roots down deep into the soil. Plenty of flowering plants for all the pollinators. And with that much mature seed head and stuff there, you know the ground's going to be covered when you come through and graze. Improved rainfall infiltration, and also acts as a bit of a drought reserve. So the normal plain grazing I'll be going through and just utilising 30 or 40%, but if it really gets tough, well then I'm going to double the length of my round, and by just upping my utilisation, it'll affect animal performance a wee bit, but it's better to do that than run out of grass. So this is basically what's left behind after we're grazing. The cattle have gone through, they've picked out the clover and the forbs out at the bottom and trampled a lot of that seed stalk on the ground. There's a few days later, the cow pats are already really starting to break down. The big thing with the cow pats is, I find, is if there's enough energy in the grass, they'll break down really fast. So like in the springtime when you've got a high protein feed going through the cows, you'll get that white film on top of the cow shit and they'll stay there for weeks and propel all the water. But you get this high energy summer grass and all the insects get straight into the cow pats and break them down extremely quick. This is in a year with a bit of rain, so all that seed's striking really quickly within a couple of weeks, coming up like hairs on a dog's back. There's a few weeks later, you see the paddock on the left up the top corner there, there's still to be grazed. So before you graze, it property looks pretty brown, then after you graze it'll look green. And here's sort of what the pastures are looking like by late autumn. So the trampled grass creates an environment for seed germination and survival, keeps the soil cooler, especially over the hot summer months, keeps the microbes more active, traps CO2 closer to the ground where the seedlings are germinating. Because one of the biggest draws on evapotranspiration for the pasture plants is when they're opening their stomata to get CO2, that's when they're losing the moisture. So if they're in a high CO2 environment, they're not having to spend as much time losing moisture through having the stomata open. The carbon over helps hold on to nutrients, especially nitrogen, and helps with soil infiltration. When I do infiltration tests, I get the best infiltration results at this time of year when I've got the ground covered like this. is one thing I wish we had more of in New Zealand. This is pastures. Forebearers introduced all the European species of grass, but we're pretty limited in C4 summer grasses. You get a bit jealous when they go to Australia and see all the diversity they've got over there as far as C4 summer growing grasses. So when they get the moisture, they can really grow some feed. The paspalum here is quite low in protein, so in a lot of areas where the paspalum's strong, I've come through with a drill where I could and put some red clover in to increase the protein level. But this stuff, like all C4s, grows extremely quickly if you've got that summer moisture. So this would have had ewes and lambs on over the spring, get fairly short, and then a bit of moisture in December, it'll all just explode into the ground. There's a bit close up of it. It gets that thick, you have to change the gear down on the four-wheeler to get through it. And it's just a comparison. These two photos are about 1 metre apart, but just having that extra diversity of the paspalum in the mix just keeps a bit of greenery in the pasture. It's just, he was basically just ryegrass, white clover, and just having that extra bit of diversity, having those paspalum roots with deeper roots going down into the ground, keeps everything green. So then when you get the rain on that, it comes away a lot faster. So you get into using the livestock as a tool. This area here did some about 2008, did some road works here. So the Napier Taupo Road actually used to come through the middle where my cattle are here. So these soils would put very little topsoil on. It was just basically subsoil, and it struggled to grow much at all. So I just left it for a whole growing season and put these heifers in here in the middle of winter. And that was all it could grow that year. So then they spent a few hours in here, trampled it, shit and peat all over it, knocked it all on the ground. And there's what it looked like in December. It just shows you the power of having the livestock in there at high densities. And the tops of the posts you're seeing there are deer fence posts, not a conventional fence. And that's a 2-year-old Murray Grey bull there. And all the grasses, especially the chicories, are towering above the cattle. But doing it like that, it's more like what we hear about as holistic grazing overseas. It's not actually sort of profitable in our sort of type scenarios here to be grazing like that, I don't think. But this is just a small trial area that I'm playing around doing those things and see if it does eventually pick enough production up to do those long grounds and have the quality to get the production out of it. So here's another example of the density improving the pasture response. So there's an area I grazed at high density January at the beginning of the year. And this is a photo I took about a week ago. So where the highest stock density was, you can see the clover and lotus in amongst it, and it's all still nice and green and vegetative. And then you go over a bit further, and where it was a lower density during the day, like the 700 kilos was a hectare was overnight, and the 200,000 kilos a hectare was during the day. And it's really noticeable now, even though both of them at the start of it were poor quality pastures like what's on the right. So it just shows in a short period of time you can change that plant community pretty quickly just by how you're using the animals across your property. This is sort of an example you might get in a bit of trouble for these days, but here's around one of my ponds. It was pretty intensely intensively managed part of the farm. I'm a pretty keen duck shooter, so we started planting this and improving this pond in the mid-80s. But I moved the cattle in here. I've got a little weir in the dam wall so I can drop the water level. So this is usually all flooded up, so then I drop it, spread a bit of seed on it, and then I bring the cattle in. So they come in here picking all the nutrients up around the trees, and then I put it back out of the paddock, because all these wetland areas are great nutrient stores. So I might as well pick it up out of here because we don't need any extra nutrients in around these wetland areas, and I'll put them back out of my paddock. So here's after the cattle are finished doing their seed breed preparation. And there's what it looks like a few months later in March. Most of that you can see there is Japanese millet. There was a few other things in there as well, a few other cereals that I put in there, and buckwheat. But they quickly go to seed and just get overtaken by the Japanese millet. And there's what it looks like at duck shooting time. You can see some of that millet in the background I haven't knocked over. All through here I've knocked it all into the water. So as soon as you knock it down, the ducks get in there and go nuts. Here's a wee picture of our soils. All this is in the same profile, just pulled it out of the ground. So there's about 25 centimetres here, a good rich topsoil, and then you've got another 25 centimetres of mixing. And then even down into our subsoil here, you can still see a lot of roots going down through here. So as soon as you get good biological activity going up higher in the soil surface, they'll push down into these soils, even though these will be high in aluminium and all sorts of nasties that roots don't really like in our country. So hopefully in another 10-15 years we start getting some good colour down in this level as well. And here's just the zooming stock is a big part of what we do. When it's getting dry, the stock are all in here, this little damp area here, because this is the only area these plants are actually photosynthesising at this time, because it's got so dry. Where if you put them in here in the winter, it's the other way around, they won't bother going down in here because it's wet and damp, and they'll all go into the dry northerly faces around the side, because that's where all the grass has got the high energy over the winter period. So you can use these sort of things to transfer nutrients around different parts of your property. One of the biggest losses of nutrients that you've got to put on when you keep putting the fertiliser on is just actually to the stock camp. So the stock will always just take it and keep piling it on a ridge, or if it's cattle, it's a flat. So the way we go through the grazing, and especially easy with the cattle with electric fences, is you go and camp them on those low fertility areas overnight. So you're always mindful of just taking off those high fertility areas and putting it onto the low, and evening that fertility out. So here, deferred grazing. So in the spring, when I'm going, this year I didn't even set stock apart from a couple of my gorge paddocks. Usually I'll set stock for 4 to 6 weeks, and then I'll start rotating again. But this year, just coming out of the drought we had, I decided I didn't want to be that hard on grasses, as they were just pretty vulnerable coming out of the drought. So I just kept rotating the whole time, and just any ewes and lambs that didn't keep up, I'd just leave them behind and catch up with them the next round. And then when we do that, when the grass starts getting away on us, I just keep bringing other mobs onto the certain blocks of the farm. So the first things that came out of the gorges in October, all the sheep that were set stocked in there came out, and they'll probably get grazed in January sometime. And then as it kept growing, I started putting cattle in with the ewes and lambs as well. So there's areas where I had cattle all rotational grazing all winter, and then just saving this up for the lambs when I wean this week. So by doing that, it just allows us to concentrate on growing as much top quality grass we can in the productive areas for the ewes and lambs, to grow the lambs as fast as we can. And then these paddocks are used to slow everything back down again. So when the lambs go in here, you'll barely see the lambs. It'll be well above their backs. You can see there's my gumboot sitting in there, so it's way higher than the gumboot. And that growing up through there is vetch. And it's just naturally there. It was obviously on the side of the road, and as I said, they adjusted the native Taupo road through some of these paddocks, and it's just naturally come back up out of the seed source that was from the side of the road.
So, Dean, do you, to get the quality into the food grazing, are you paying attention to that in terms of what time you take those paddocks out of the rotation so that you actually have, because I think, well, I used to think of the food grazing is you just take it out and most of it would be lower quality stuff that you put your, that post-weaning you chuck ewes on. So how do you get the quality into it?
Yeah, so this was all rotation graze with cattle all over the winter in those areas. You always get strong white clover and the legumes in there. And when I shut it up, if you look out across it, it does look pretty rough. Because all you're seeing is the seed heads, but if you actually look down on it, there's all this vetch and lotus and all the clovers down on the bottom still. So when you put the lambs in there, they'll put their head right down into it. So you quite often see in the spring, when the animals are chasing energy, they'll just be grazing the tops, and then all of a sudden in the summer, when you get a bit of length to your pastures, the sheep and the cattle will put their heads right down in the pasture because they're chasing the protein in the bottom. And the thing is to have it thick enough so when they go through there, they trample it on the ground. And you can get reasonable trampling with sheep when things are all thick enough, especially when you get vetch and lotus and things like that coming all up through it. And I'm not too worried if a bits of it stick up. I like it sort of, some of it can be trampled and you have the old patch sticking up. It all acts as a windbreak. And later on in the season, I quite often find with the cattle, when you get all the lush growth come away in the autumn, they'll actually go back to those bits that are left standing that are a bit rank, and they'll use that to balance their diet out in sort of April, May, because they need a bit of fibre, a bit extra fibre in their diet at that time. So here's another paddock closed up. You can see the strong white clover in here, and the size and the health of the leaf there. There's even a 4-leaf clover just in there as well. You get a lot of 4-leaf clover when the clover's all vigorous and healthy like that. So this will be grazed probably mid-January with the lambs. So by then the seed head will be fully mature. But there will still be plenty of this good quality clover on the bottom. I always tell people, when they look at my pastures, when was grazing the dairy heifers, the dairy farmers would come and look at my place in January, and they'd look out and see a seed head, and they'd be worried about my quality, And I say, well, there's still 2,500, 3,000 kilos of good quality grass in there. The animals just got to look for it. When they do, they'll knock it down. And then I showed you a photo earlier on, back in April with the cattle and the nice lush grass, and they'd always come down to me in April or March, and they go, oh gee, I wish we had some grass like this. And I said, well, I've only got grass like this in my environment because I did what I did in January. Here's a northerly face where the sheep are on the left here. It's a little bit hard to see, but this is all full of birdsfoot trefoil. And you see these sort of dark little spiky bits up here. There's rat's tail. I'm not too sure if North Canterbury has rat's tail or not. I don't remember seeing it down here, but it's not very good grass. And it's really good at holding fragile soils together. So always use that with the dairy grazers. I'd take those sort of rat's tail areas, and it was a good place to win. I put them overnight in the winter when it was really wet. But it's traditional in Hawke's Bay for the farmers. They'll put the cattle in the paddock and they'll leave them in there till they chew all that rat's tail back. And it's really high in silica, so if you have years where you have a drought, your sheep will wear their teeth out trying to eat it. It's that hard. And then in the damp parts of the paddock, you'll get lotus major instead of the birdsfoot trefoil. And that's just come away on our property over the last 15 years or so with giving the longer summer rotations, and it allows all this stuff to go to seed and the seed's just building up. So after this last drought, I've had a hell of a lot of birdsfoot trefoil come up on my northerly faces. So changing over the shedding sheep, my sheep are looking a bit rough, got half fleeces and there's wool all over the fences and all over the paddocks. I kind of like the fact that I'm not going to have to pay to share some of these. These are full Wiltshire hogget there, so these are just hoggets with my lambs. And just showing the difference 8 weeks makes in the pasture from this photo to this photo here, this same paddock. And you can see in this one here, the sheep are really stoked, just stick their heads right down into it with the quality in the top. Where when the grass is at this stage, they'll be eating just the energy at the top of it. So here's one of my spiel on carbon. Carbon reserves in your soil are an asset for your farm. This will help buffer the effects of floods and droughts and store nutrients, reducing downstream issues. CO2 is an essential plant nutrient, not a pollutant. We need to celebrate the stable climate we've had in the last 100 years that's allowed our civilization to flourish. And here's my contact details. And the photo on the left there is some of our Aussie white lambs, about 100 days. Those of you who haven't seen an Aussie white before.
Thanks very much, Dean. I should have probably added at the start, in terms of Dean's soils, we did a Nicole Masters soils course there a couple of years ago, and we dug some holes, and we had about 6 different groups digging holes and did visual soil assessments and counting worms. And I think pretty much every group got over 80 worms per spade, which I've never found anywhere before. And I also did we did a bit of a soil carbon pilot sampling session with a guy from Lancaster Research called Paul Mudge, just to kind of test out how you do paired site sampling. So we picked the site at Dean's place and we tried to match one, a simple one across the road that was managed to match them. While I suppose we took the soil cores out, and the topsoil depth is quite hard to see because of the variability, whether it's significantly deeper or not, but we did find these big, thick streaks of carbon just going down in a couple of cores that we took out of Dean's place, and there was a wormhole that I could stick my pinky through at about 500 deep that still covered its integrity even when I poked my finger through it. And when we took the cores out of Dean's place, you bang the steel pipe on the ground, basically lift it up and you can push it out into this chute. And we took all of them at 600 deep, so that's about as deep as we could get them before we hit the subsoil, before we hit the, what do you call it, what are you on the pan there, on papa. And all of Dean's swelled out to about 62, 63 centimetres, whereas the ones that we took across the road that we managed to stay at 60. And there's some funny things going on there, I suppose the other thing to add to that in terms of soil health, structure and function is Dean had about 380 mil thunderstorm about 2 years ago that just parked up on top of his farm, and the only erosion that came out of that storm was the steep gullies where it actually was the native bush that sucked into the rivers as opposed to the grass and the soil. So I suppose just my experience of spending a bit of time there, I suppose just adding a bit of testament to the fact that what Dean's been doing here really has transformed the way that those soils function. Anyway, that's enough from me. Probably got 5-10 minutes for some questions, so I'll open it up. Back off the cuff.
What have you done? What does it mean for your stocking rate? Are you stocking more or less? Or?
Much the same. Haven't really changed it much, but Yeah, much the same. I haven't really changed the stock rate much. As I say, we've changed what we're doing a wee bit. If we have the opportunities, we'll trade a few lambs in the summer as well. Yeah.
Are you growing more grass?
Yeah. But yeah, as you see, we like to grow more and trample it back in. And then you have a tough year like we had last year. We weren't doing much trampling at all last year. I just had a few areas that I've done that deferred grazing on that are trampled, but the rest of it, usually when I come onto those deferred areas, the areas that I've had to use lambs rotating on, will get a good kick of growth, but those areas didn't get that last summer, so basically the early spring deferred stuff, I got to trample, and then after that it was mine it for the rest of the summer through till middle of winter. It was basically June before we got rain last autumn.
So your system's designed to get you through the tough times rather than get more out of the farm, more productivity out of the farm.
Yeah, well, if you got a destock, it's pretty hard to buy back in. Like Stortford Lodge is either the cheapest sale in the country or the most expensive sale in the country to go and buy stock from. So it's a big advantage being able to keep your stock through the tough times. And then, as I say, I quite often, if I'm in the position, I'll go in and Stortford and buy lambs in January because I've kept that deferred grazing there and I've got some decent feed. I can see plenty of feed ahead of me. I'll go and buy some lambs when they're cheap in January because everyone else is too short to be dry. Got no bottom in their grass to take lambs through. Like even this year, everyone's already starting to say, I've got cattle feed, but I don't have any lamb feed left. But you can see in our photos, we've still got tons of clover and legume stuff in there for the lambs.
How has it affected, if your stocking rates stayed similar, has it affected profitability?
With the dairy grazing, we were that stable pretty good because we were able to always get through without buying in feed. It's been a bit tricky because we've changed systems going from the dairy grazing into our own stock, and then now we're starting to go back into more sheep. So yeah, it worked well with the dairy grazers because we didn't have that big fluctuation. If you had a tough year, you had to buy in a lot of feed. We're always able to get through with having to buy minimal feed. So hopefully, once we get back into a stable system, it will again. But the last few years has been building up careful stock of our own stock, and with these sheep, I've spent a lot of money on these Wiltshires in the last. They're not cheap. My Wiltshire 2 so I paid $317 last January for, and then spending money on these embryos and stuff in Australia as well. So we're looking at pushing into that sort of sheep genetics type thing and sell a few rams and stuff as well. So.
How much of your fencing is permanent and how much is hot wires and
we've got a lot of paddocks. So I think I have 60 paddocks and 145 hectares effective. And then Sam will tell you how much electric fencing gear I've got. I've got a heap of it, sheds and sheds full if it's not out on the farm, and a lot of the time it's all out on the farm. So I've got a heap of Kiwi Tech
so
stuff.
that's your main input is time and fencing?
Yeah, so as they all continuously changing those fences around to move the fertility around. So if you've got the cattle going around, you make sure that they're not overnighting in the same break every time. The next one round they go around. And I even mix up which directions I go around the paddock, so I don't like to graze. If you see your breaks don't go this way, the next time or the next season I'll go the opposite direction. It really confuses the old boy. You sort of, you set them out there to do it and you'll move stuff the wrong way.
Given the outstanding pasture growing, what do your neighbours think is going on? Are you getting a bit of a following, or are they?
No. I had a field day about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and invited quite a few around. And we definitely got a fair few. I originally did it for 2 people that were interested that farm close by, and both of them didn't turn up in the end. But yeah, I always tell people my immediate neighbour farms to make me look good. He's continuously set stock. So.
What is your animal health output and do you use free choice minerals?
No, I'm too cheap for free choice minerals, basically. I drench as little as possible with the cattle and the lambs. If some need a drench, I'll just go and drench the tail quarter sort of thing. So if they're putting on weight and looking healthy, I don't bother drenching.
What growth rates are you getting on your lambs?
The Wiltshires tend to be a wee bit slower, well, especially up until Christmas. I'm finding they're not growing as fast as my Texel crosses, and then they do better once that feed quality and the hot weather seems to kick in. So by the end of January, that's working that much the same. Over this summer, I'm usually getting around 180 to 220 grams a day with those Texel cross type stuff in the tough summer. But we try and get as many away through Christmas as we can. We'll get 50 or 60% pre-Christmas. And most years we've got not many, it's just a handful left by the end of January. And when I did do some cover crops type stuff up to about 4 years ago. For the last few years, it's just been my grass.
So you sort of said that you've got about an 18-day round. How do you decide whether